Ancient Rome was a brutal place for anyone who wasn't born a male. While their empire was built on the backs of slaves and women had almost no rights to speak of, there were some punishments that were even considered too much for the Romans. And these are the three most terrifying punishments for sacred virgins in ancient Rome. Hi everyone. Number 3 is one of the worst ways to die, so let's jump right into it. Before we get started, I would like to say thank you for being awesome. During the days of ancient Rome, many different cultures were being conquered and brought under the control of Rome. One of the ways they kept the conquered people in line was through religion. In the Roman Empire, the practice of human sacrifice was not uncommon. There are several accounts from Roman historians about the sacrifices made by the Gauls, Germanic peoples, Dacians, and many others. The worst part of this is that these people weren't just sacrificing others. It seems that they were also sacrificing their own children. Obviously, this was something that went against Roman culture, but what they did about it was pretty awful. If any of the conquered people were captured with their children while trying to perform a human sacrifice, both the adult and child would be killed. This included the sacred virgins. In the case of the sacred virgins, the punishment would be worse because they were seen as more valuable. You see, the Romans had their own sacred virgins, which were girls who were set aside from childhood to serve the gods. Their duty was to live a life free of men and marriage. Instead of raising families, they would serve their god through song and dance. These girls were promised to the gods during a festival called the Fornalia. During this celebration, parents would bring their kids to the temple of the Lares and offer them up to become sacred virgins. Many times this happened when the girl was only a baby, so you can imagine how horrifying it would be for these young women to find out their fate when they grew up. They knew they were promised to the gods, so they knew they wouldn't be able to have a normal life. They weren't allowed to marry or have children. If they broke their vows, they were severely punished. But if they didn't, they still had a horrible life ahead of them. The virgin's role was to serve her specific god through song and dance. She would do this every single day until she died. The priestess could keep her position for as long as she lived, but there was no escaping her fate. As a sacred virgin, she would eventually die during a ritual. Her god would choose how she would die based on what kind of service he needed from her. Sometimes the virgin would be burned alive, while other times she would be thrown into a volcano. Other times she would be drowned. Regardless of how her death was carried out, it was always painful and horrific. And even though the punishment of the sacred virgins was bad enough, the Romans took things even further by punishing the virgins from the conquered lands in the same way. Let's take a look at just how awful this was for these poor girls. When someone was chosen to be a virgin sacrifice, they were taken from their family and locked away in a temple. Here they would be forced to go through months of training. They were taught songs and dances that honored their god. They were also given gifts and fine clothes. The goal was to make the sacrifice seem as joyful as possible, when in reality it was anything but. Once the girl was ready, she would be led out of the temple and to the altar where she would give her life. Now, that's bad enough on its own, being locked away for months and then forced to dance for your life. But that wasn't all. The thing that made this sacrifice even more traumatizing was the fact that you didn't know when it would happen. There was no set time for the ritual. It could happen at any moment. This meant that the virgin had to live in constant fear of her life. She never knew when she would be taken to the altar. It was this stress that drove many of the girls insane. You might think that being chosen as a virgin sacrifice was the worst that could happen, but this was only the beginning for these girls. If they survived the sacrifice, their punishment was far from over. After a girl was selected as a virgin sacrifice, she would have to complete the ritual. That meant she had to live out the remainder of her life in the temple. She could never leave and she could never see her family again. On top of that, she would have to watch as other girls were taken away and sacrificed. 2. Hanging upside down. While we may think of hanging as a quick and painless form of capital punishment, it was anything but back in the days of ancient Rome. This form of punishment was reserved for those who had done the ultimate crime, betraying Rome. If a Roman citizen was found guilty of treason, they would be hung upside down as a warning to others. But this was only the beginning of their punishment. To start, the person would be tied up and suspended by ropes from a crane. Then they would be left to hang for hours on end. This would cause immense pain and suffering as the weight of their body pulled on their joints and muscles. Eventually, the person would lose consciousness and their organs would begin to shut down. This process would take hours, meaning that the victim would be in excruciating pain for a long time. Even if the person was innocent, they could be hung upside down as a way to extract information from them. In many cases, the victim would be tortured in this way until they confessed to the crime, even if they didn't commit it. The Romans were known for their brutality, and they didn't think twice when it came to punishing those who went against them. In one instance, Cicero, who was one of Rome's greatest orators and statesmen, was almost hung upside down. He was accused of taking bribes while he was consul and was found guilty by the Roman Senate. However, he was able to escape punishment and even exile by appealing to the people. He told them that if they saved him, he would give them grain and money, and they agreed. He was only able to avoid his gruesome fate, thanks to his popularity among the people. Number 1. Crucifixion. If you've ever watched Gladiator, you know that crucifixion was a terrible way to die. Well, that's exactly what these women had to deal with. In ancient Rome, crucifixion was used as a form of punishment for the most heinous crimes, such as murder, treason, and revolt. However, it was also used as a deterrent. Crucifixions were often carried out in public areas such as the Forum Magnum and the Colosseum, so that passers-by would be warned of what would happen if they committed a crime. However, this punishment was not limited to criminals. It was also used on sacred virgins who were deemed enemies of the state. In these cases, the virgin would be crucified as a warning to others not to follow in her footsteps. There were different ways that a person could be crucified. The most common way was for the victim to be nailed to a cross and left to die slowly from their wounds. Another way was for the victim to be nailed to a rock monolith. This was a tall stone pillar that had been erected in public areas throughout the empire. The victim's hands and feet would be nailed to the sides of the pillar, and then they would be left to die of exhaustion. Sometimes a victim would be left to die of thirst or exposure. Whatever the method, crucifixion was a horrible and painful way to die. One of the most famous examples of a sacred virgin being crucified was that of the Vestal Virgin Claudia Quinta. Claudia was a Vestal Virgin who was accused of stealing sacred items from the temple. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. She was crucified in the Forum Magnum as a warning to other Vestal Virgins. Her story was written down so that future generations would learn from her mistakes. There are many stories of sacred virgins being punished brutally in ancient Rome. These stories serve as a reminder of the dark side of Roman history and the lengths to which they would go in order to maintain control. The Romans were known for their brutality, and they didn't think twice when it came to punishing those who went against them. From burning alive to crucifixion, the Romans used all forms of torture and punishment on sacred virgins who were deemed enemies of the state. Thanks for watching. See you next time.